Hey everybody, welcome back to another video on the channel. So I'm going to read chapter 6 of the first book of the Left Behind the Kids series, The Vanishings. This is the book right here, book 1 of the Left Behind the Kids series, The Vanishings, and I'm going to read chapter 6. So we covered the 4 kids, we covered their backstories, we covered their history, their origins, we covered the night that'll change their lives forever, and now we're going to go over the aftermath of what happens. So yeah, let me see. Page 75. Part 3, The Morning After. Chapter 6, Judd returns home. Judd was so keyed up, so excited, and yet so worried about what his parents were going to do when they discovered that he had disappeared. He couldn't even imagine having fallen asleep, yet he had. He figured out how to make the seat back recline, and he was soon staring at the dark ceiling, his eyes beginning to grow accustomed to the low light. He folded his arms across his chest and forced himself to breathe more and more slowly. He had to relax, need to get some rest if he was going to succeed in finding a place to hide out in London. Hottie, the flight attendant, glided by every half hour or so, and Judd realized he was finally starting to unwind when he quit looking forward to watching her. Eventually, the slow blinking began, then he turned sideways and curled up. Now he had to close his eyes, or he would appear to stare at the large man in the window seat next to him. The man had not said one word the entire flight, but Judd noticed that he had bowed his head before eating. That Judd would never do, not even in private, unless he was with his family. That was another reason he needed to be out on his own, so he wouldn't be embarrassed by all their religious rituals. His mother hated when Judd referred to her faith as a religion. She had told her so many times he had memorized it. Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship with God through Christ. Yeah, okay, Judd thought. Judd annoys you how long he had been sleeping. In fact, he wasn't sure he had slept at all. And if he had slept, was he really awake now? He was disoriented, in the same position he had crawled into how long ago? He felt as if he had been sleeping and had not moved. But his eyes were open. Something was different. A blanket. The flight attendant must have draped it over him. He looked at his watch, not quite 11 at night, 4 in the morning, out and over the Atlantic. He knew the plane had to be nearly halfway between England and the States now. The man next to him had a blanket too, and was folded neatly in his lap. The airflow above him was directed on his face, and Judd imagined him sweating in his sleep. He was spread out over that seat, hands at his sides, head back, mouth open. Judd was grateful the man was not snoring. With his chin on his shoulder, Judd was just inches from the big man. But that was the way with airplanes. Strangers had to sit close to each other. He looked across the aisle to where the drinker seemed to have collapsed onto his tray table. Beyond him, the magazine writer, the one who introduced himself to the old man, sat sleeping with his back straight, his head down, chin on his chest. Head of those two were the elderly couple, the Petersons. Judd couldn't see the woman, but she was small and hidden in her seat. Her husband had tucked a pillow behind him and slept with his head poking out into the aisle. Judd was still barely awake when Hottie came by. She had to avoid the old man as she slipped past. Judd mustered the courage to wit and whispered, "Thanks for the blanket." She flashed him a smile. "Oh, you're welcome, hon," she said. "My partner Tony brought you that. Need anything else?" He was too tongue-tied to say any more. He shook his head, turned back to face the big man on his right, and drifted off to sleep again. Activity behind him nagged Judd to sleeping consciousness. How long had he slept this time? It seemed only a few minutes, but it could have been hours. He didn't want to rouse, didn't want to open his eyes. He fought to stay asleep. Someone had said something. Another person was up and about. Someone walked by quickly. Surely it wasn't dawn yet. Sunlight peeking through the window coverings surely would have awakened him. For a minute, Judd heard nothing but and was grateful. He brought his watch up to his face and peeked ever so slightly at it. He couldn't make it out. It seemed nearly the same time as the last time he had checked. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes. The man next to him must have gone to the bathroom. Ryan and Judd felt him get up and get by. Judd's long legs were stretched under the seat in front of him. No way was that man agile enough to have climbed over him without his knowing. He squinted and stared at the darkness, wondering if he was dreaming. The flight attendant hurried past. No, she more than hurried. She was nearly sprinting up the aisle toward the cockpit. This was no dream. Judd sat straight up and noticed a few others doing the same. He craned his neck and looked back toward the circular stairway that led to coach class. He heard too much activity for the middle of the night. Someone shrieked, another called out, but he couldn't make it out. Just as Hottie reached the cockpit, Judd saw the door open and one of the pilots and mosey out. He had nearly bowled him over. Judd couldn't hear them, but it was clear she was upset and maybe scared. Did she know something the pilot didn't? Was something wrong with the plane? Wouldn't that be a kick in the teeth, Judd dying in a plane crash on his first night of freedom? His parents would never understand. Hottie pulled the pilot out of the aisle and into the cooking compartments. Judd was desperate to know what was going on. He heard a noise up there as if she had fallen. He leaned to the aisle and saw her on her knees whimpering. The captain seemed to be trying to comfort her, and she held on to him as if scared to death. Judd suddenly felt very young and very afraid. Behind him, more and more people were crying out. What was going on? What were they saying? The young man and the drunk across the aisle were both sound asleep. Judd could no longer see the old man, and the two people in front of Judd must have slid down in their seats too. The pilot left Hottie in the galley area and slipped out into the aisle. As if studying the seats in first class. Judd pulled off his blanket and tried to catch the captain's eye to read something on his face, but it was too dark, and the pilot was distracted. From the seat ahead of him and to the left, he heard a voice of the old woman. "What in the world?" she said. "Harold? Was something wrong with the old man?" Judd couldn't resist sitting to look. Everyone else in first class seemed to be sleeping. He fastened his seatbelt and rose to look at the old couple. The woman sat there with her husband's sweater and dress pants in her hands. Judd shook his head trying to clear his mind. What was she doing with her husband's clothes? And where was he? Obviously, that's what she was wondering too. The pilot hurried past before Judd could think about how to phrase a question. All he wanted to know was what was going on. But the pilot and certainly the flight attendant didn't seem to know either. When the pilot reached the stairs, Mrs. Peterson stood and called out to him, "Sir, my husband." Just saw the pilot put a finger to his lips and whisper, "I know, we'll find him. I'll be right back." And now here came Hottie. Judd said, "Ma'am," but she didn't answer. She grabbed the pilot by the shoulders from behind. "Should I turn on the cabin lights?" she asked. "No," the pilot whispered. "Less people know the right now, the better." What did that mean? Judd watched the two hurry down the stairs. He turned back to see the old woman talking to the rider behind her. He dragged his fingers through his long blonde hair. "Trouble, ma'am?" Buck asked. Buck said, "It's my Harold," she said. "Does he need something here?" Buck asked, stretching. "He's gone." "I'm sorry?" "He disappeared." "Well," Buck said, "I'm sure he slipped off to the washroom while you were sleeping. Would you mind checking for me? And take a blanket." "Ma'am, I'm afraid he's gone off naked. He's a religious person who'll be terribly embarrassed." Judd still stood as if glued to the floor in front of his seat. He watched Buck Williams climb over the sleeping drunk in the island seat and move up to take a blanket from the old woman. Buck crouched and studied the clothes Mr. Peterson left in the sleep. "Does your husband have epilepsy?" "No." "Sleepwalking?" "I'll be right back." Judd didn't want to look down onto the seats in front of him, and he certainly didn't want to look to his right where the big man had been. But he forced himself to. Over the back seats ahead of him, we saw blankets, pillows, and full sets of clothes, glasses, jewelry, and even a man's wig laying on his seat. His heart racing, Judd looked next to him. That neatly folded blanket now lay atop the trousers, empty socks, and the shoes. On the back of the seat lay the limp, still buttoned white shirt, the still knotted tie, and little bits of metal. Judd's knees were weak. Other passengers woke up and discovered their seatmates missing, their clothes left behind. Judd close to the big man's pile of clothes turned onto the overhead light. You could still smell the man's cologne, and those tiny bits of metal were dental fillings. Buck Williams moved past Judd's seat. "Excuse me," said to another passenger, "looking for someone." "Who isn't?" a woman said. The pilot rushed back towards the cockpit, followed by his flight attendant. She told Buck, "Sir, I need to ask you to return to your seat and fasten your belt." Hottie turned to give Judd a look as if she expected the same from him. He sat quickly and refused to look at the clothes his seatmate had left behind. Buck tried to explain. "Everybody's looking for someone," Hottie said. "We hope to have some information for you in a few minutes. Now, please." When Hottie passed him, Judd quickly left the seat and ran to the stairway. Halfway down, he saw the cabin lights finally come on. All over the plane, people held up clothes and gasped or shrieked that someone was missing. Judd walked stiff-legged back to his seat and heard Buck tell Mrs. Peterson, "Apparently many people are missing." She looked afraid and puzzled. Judd was afraid too, but he wasn't puzzled. As the pilot came over the intercom, pleading for people to remain calm, the full realization of what had happened hit Judd. He didn't know how many other people on the plane had any idea, but he sure did. Christ to come back as promised and raptured his church. Judd lowered his face into his hands and shuddered. It was the worst nightmare imaginable. He was wide awake. He and most passengers on that plane had been left behind. Judd raised his head when Hottie approached again. Her face was red and puffy as she breathed fast, seeming to fight for control. She stopped to the aisle right next to him and put her hand on his seat back to steadying herself. Draped over her arm was a sweaty vest and a shirt and the tie still in it. The nameplate dangling in front of Judd read Tony. The pilot's voice came over the intercom and announced that cards would be passed out to determine who and how many were missing. Hottie rose, the sleeping drunk, on the aisle and asked if any of his party were missing. He drooled, his eyes heavy. Missing? No, there's nobody in this party but me. He closed his eyes again and Judd knew that he had no idea what had happened. Later, when the captain announced they were turning around and heading back to Chicago, Judd led the cheering. Home had never sounded so good. His plan? His crazy, stupid, selfish plan was out the window now. He would pay his dad back for the money he had already taken for the card, and if it wasn't too late, he would get right with God. It seems strange to even think that way, and suddenly realized that if he was right about what had happened, he would be going home to an empty house. Judd dropped his head again and felt the tears come. From across the aisle, he heard Buck say to the sleeping drunk, "I'm sorry, Frem, you're going to want to be awake for this." The drunk said, "If we're not crashing, don't bother me." In spite of their terror, passengers seemed to be settled down for the long flight back to Chicago. Judd refused all offers of food and beverage, unable to think about anything but what he might find at home. As the heavy plane retraced its route across the Atlantic, it retreated from the rising sun. The pilot announced they were going all the way back to Chicago because most of their airports were jammed and closed. He also did expect chaos on the ground because these disappearances had just happened everywhere around the world at the same time. Judd saw Hattie and Buck talking. She told him that even more bizarre, the vanishings was the fact that every single little child on the plane disappeared. Many adults, some teenagers, but all the babies. That awakened the sleeping man in the aisle. What in the blazes are you two talking about? He said. We're about to land in Chicago. Hattie said, I've got to run. Chicago? The man demanded. You don't want to know, Buck said. Joe looked out the window as the plane cut through the clouds and offered a view of the Chicago area. Smoke. Fire. Cars off the road and smashed into each other and trees and guardrails. Planes in pieces on the ground. Emergency vehicles. Lights flashing, pickling their way around the debris. As the airport came into view, it was obvious no one was going anywhere soon. There were planes as far as the eye could see, some crashed, some burning. There was gridlocked in line. People charged to the grass toward the terminals. Cranes and wreckers tried to clear the paths through the front of the terminal so traffic could move. But that would take hours, if not days. The pilot announced that he would have to land the plane 2 miles from the terminal. The passengers would have to slide down flammable emergency chutes to get into the ground. And all Joe cared about was getting onto the ground. He would run all the way to the terminal where he could call home. He would ask someone how he could get home and was willing to pay any amount. He had that credit card and wads of cash in his pocket. Half an hour later, when Joe came huffing and puffing past the crowds into the bigger crowds in the terminal, he saw lines 100 long waiting for the phones. On TVs throughout the terminal, he watched news stories from around the world of people disappearing right out of their clothes in front of the camera. A nurse vanished as a woman was about to give birth, and the baby disappeared before it was born. A groom disappeared as he was putting on his bride's ring on her finger. Pallbearers at a funeral disappeared while carrying a casket which fell and propped over, revealing the corpse had vanished too. Judd raced outside and through the jammed cars, following the lines of people to cabs and limousines. He sprinted to the front and stuffed a huge roll of bills into the driver's hand. Judd told him his address, and the man pulled away. It took 2 hours to pick their way through the results of crashes and fires. Limo drivers said some people disappeared with stuff cooking on the stove, and there was no one to turn it off. That's why you see so many homes burned or burning. When they finally reached Judd's street in Mount Prospect, the driver stopped and said, "There you go, son. Sure hope you find what you're expecting." "I hope I don't," Judd said. So yeah, that's chapter 6 of the book Wanted to Live Find the Kids series, The Vanishings. Judd returns home. And take care, everybody. Another video from my Storytime channel. Take care.